Welcome. Welcome to the Computer History Museum. I'm John Holler, the CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you tonight on behalf of our trustees and our staff and our members and our many volunteers. Among the most amazing volunteers are the advisory board for this new Center on Entrepreneurship, which we're helping to conduct a beta and prototype event for tonight, and you'll meet some of them later on. History is our middle name, and we feel we have the history thing pretty well nailed. We've got 110,000 artifacts in our collection. We've got 65,000 square feet of historical exhibition space. We take 80 oral histories a year. We've now got 800 of those in our archive. Revolution downstairs, which is a 25,000 square feet exhibition, has got 125,000 words, 1,500 artifacts, 155 screens, 16 films, 4 theaters. All of this that I just mentioned is on the internet. We get about 5 million unique page views a year. Our YouTube channel is now approaching 7 million viewers. We're on KQED, television and radio, Minnesota Public Radio. We'll start syndicating our speaker series on PBS this summer. That's a great history platform from which to build. Tonight, you're seeing the expansion of the museum's mission and its interpretation of our mission. Because while the history is certainly important and will always be the bedrock on which the museum is built, the stories of the impact of computing on technology, on our economy, on the society worldwide, and the implications of computing for all of us for the future are as important in our eyes as the original historical mission. So history, impact, and the implications for the future are what we're building the museum on beginning tonight. And what you're going to see tonight is a prototype event, which we'll be talking to you about in just a moment, that represents the museum's strategic expansion into those important areas of impact and implications. It's my pleasure now to turn the mic over to a member of our advisory board on the Center on Entrepreneurship that we're building, someone who's been instrumental in building many, many things in Silicon Valley over his storied career in venture investing, and who's been doing such amazing work helping us to shape this. And he's going to tell you a little bit more about what we're up to. Gary Morgenthaler, I'd like to introduce you and bring you up. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and privilege to be with you here tonight for this beta. I'm here for the same reason that you are. We're excited about what the Computer History Museum is doing, excited about its mission, and excited about the team that has come together under John Holler's leadership, and excited about John Holler's leadership. So that's why I have become engaged and involved. I would start by saying that John is a world-class leader. He's a world-class manager, but maybe foremost, he's a world-class storyteller. So when John called me and said, you know, Gary, I want to talk to you because I think there's a story here that's not being told. And I think it's a bigger story even than the one that we've been telling. And I need your help. And I need your friends' help. Because there's a story of how did this happen? How did this technology come to be? How did these products, how did this community come together? How has this impact on society happened? And so we started talking about it, and we said, you know, that is a big story, and it's not being told. And the people who created that story are with us, but may not always be. That story is important, not just because it's history, not just because it led to products or industries, but because it's had an impact on society, and that impact is growing. And it is growing all the time, and it's going to become very, very important in the future. So it's important to understand what happened, who made it happen, how it happened, but important as anything else, what are the lessons for the future? What are the implications to society? And what can we learn from this to replicate it, to make it better, and to spread? So with that, a group of people came together, and I want to acknowledge them quickly. So for the advisory committee, and for those of you who are here tonight, is Chuck Holloway here? Chuck? There you are. Thank you. Chuck and Regis McKenna, right there. Thank you. Steve Smith, thank you very much. And the subject of tonight's beta, Dan Warmenhoven, there you are. Not with us tonight, but very much part of the committee are Erwin Fetterman, Floyd Kwame, Dave Martin, Ray Rothrock, and Larry Sonsini. So I want to thank them all for their contributions. I'm here because I'm excited about this. I'm excited about this mission. I'm excited about telling these stories. I'm excited about letting people know what happened, how, and why. It's important to know who did it, but it's most important, what can we learn from it? What can our children learn from it? How can this be carried forward to future generations? So we looked around as a committee and we said the most important thing we can do is we can find someone to lead this project. And so we conducted a search with the able assistance of Tom Friel. We interviewed a number of candidates. We said they had to be world-class in leadership to fit in here, world-class in management skills to fit in here, world-class in terms of pickup of the technology and creating a community. But most of all, and this is what got the venture capitalists around the table saying yes, most of all, this has to be a person who can do a whole lot with a very little bit of resource. So all of VCs said, yes, that's our person. And we looked amongst it, and when we found Marguerite, we said, this is the woman to lead. And with that, I'm going to hand this to Marguerite.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to meet, to join John and all of the trustees of the museum, as well as Gary and the rest of the steering committee members. So you are here as part of this experiment. The center has a mandate to collect, to preserve for posterity the essential stories of the people, the organizations, the institutions, the entire ecosystem that have made Silicon Valley what it is, and also places around the world, where they're come from and where they're going. This is a big task. And so for the past 4 months or so, since I've been here at the museum, we've been going through a series of prototypes. What would it be to collect oral histories of some of the founders of the key institutions? So we've had extensive interviews with the founders of Cisco, with Silicon Valley Bank, early people at National Semiconductor, and have plans for more. What would it be like if we thought about collecting the key artifacts that also document that? What about research? If this place could be not only a place that collects artifacts and stories, that becomes a resource for researchers, a platform for collaboration, for leading academics, industry people, and the museum's own curators and staff here to come together. So we started a project with LinkedIn and some others to look at the movement of people coming to the Valley and moving throughout the Valley over the past time. And you were a part of that tonight as you put your red dot on the map. Where did you come from? This is a place that is a magnet for bringing people together. What would it be like if also the center could be a place for education, to create new content for those who come to the museum, more than 100,000 a year, 5 million that come to our website, not only a physical place for education, but also an online place to share these insights. So we've had a series of education programs where we started to create content, and tonight's experience with NetApp is just one of those 360 views of a case, because as we know, innovation is a team sport, and as you've seen, each of you have been invited here because you have an important perspective to share. The people in this room, you represent investors, entrepreneurs, academics, observers, the people who are making real decisions that are the stuff of history in the making. And what would it be like also if the center could play a role and a voice in helping influence leaders who are making decisions that will impact the sustainability of this place and others? So we've been involved with inviting policymakers here who want to understand. So over the past few months, we've had a series of prototypes, and tonight's event is one part of that. As a steering committee, we are talking about what would it be like if we could prototype having something that drew on a little bit on our oral histories, that also added in an independent voice of academic research, that also could create new content that would be compelling, that would take the past and also have implications for the next generation, and then have an event. Guess what? That's what we're doing tonight. We are having this prototype. We're going to show some of the oral history videos that we had from Don Valentine, Dave Hitz, and Dan Warmanhoven, who courageously, in our steering committee, when I said, well, who's willing to prototype? He said, I will be the guinea pig. So thank you to Dan and friends who were recruited to here. We all know that this process of prototyping is the spirit of how we can move forward faster, move forward better, because tonight we're not asking you to be critics, we're asking you to be co-creators of the experience. The people who are joining us here represent different views, a 360 view, not only the key decision makers, some of the key decision makers and leaders of the company, but also customers. People have gone on to play different roles in the Valley. We are taking the oral histories that we had before, and we'll show some of that. We're collecting the video from tonight with not only the people here on stage, but your comments. We're going to be following up with additional interviews, one-on-one interviews with many others who have been involved in the NetApp story. And together we think that will create not only the event tonight, but a new, deeper, richer history of one remarkable company in one remarkable place. So imagine, tonight we're having Silicon Valley 360 NetApp. Another time, maybe it would be Silicon Valley 360 Sequoia. Or maybe it's Beijing 360 Tencent. You can imagine how rich histories of key institutions and the key people in key places could begin to build this out. But of course, the event and this project is just one small part of what we're doing. But we're hoping by illustrating this and being a part of it together, it will capture, ignite, really, your imagination of what this new center, what this new mission, this expanded mission for the museum is. We're building something to pay it forward. We know that you are here together. We can create new resources. We can both preserve the past, but also empower the future generation of innovators and leaders. And so tonight, we're inviting you to co-create this and to give us your feedback. Help us make the ideas better, and join us on this journey as we think, what can we create here that will serve not only our community here in our backyard for the future, but places around the world. So with that, I'd like to introduce Bill Barnett, who is a distinguished professor, will be our moderator. Bill is the Tom Siebel Professor of Business, Leadership, and Strategy at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford. Very well known, renowned around the world for his insights into strategy, especially for companies that are rapidly moving in dynamic environments and their competitive strategy. There's no better expert to be applying that expertise to NetApp. He wrote his first case about NetApp in about 1995 and has written 6 others since then. So tonight we'll be in the hands of Bill, who will be moderating with this group of people. Bill will be joining the stage, but before he does, we're going to tee it up by showing you this first very rough video to give you a sneak peek at NetApp over the past 20 years. Please enjoy.
We had so many meetings with VCs, and they would say, so you do everything a Sun Workstation can do and more, right? And we're like, no, we do less. And we struggled to explain, like we said, if you want to make toast, you could make toast in your oven, but a toaster's better.
The founders came to me and said, we think we need different and better leadership? You have any ideas?
Dan was on board 2 weeks later.
I think we had a fairly clear runway for quite a while. I don't know, we were lucky. For 5 years we really didn't have, we had competitors from Auspex and eventually we had one from EMC, but the company that could have really damaged us was Sun, and they never responded.
We went public with 45, then we did 90, then we did 150, 300-ish, and like boom, 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 boom. It's like, holy shit, they're a billion. That's fast.
The NASDAQ Composite thundered past the magical 5,000 milestone, a feat accomplished so quickly, some market watchers just shake their heads.
This is terrific. You know, we've predicted a 5,000 level on a NASDAQ at the beginning of the year, but we're expecting that sometime by year end, certainly not in the first quarter.
We could see, based on customers, et cetera, that they were slowing down spending plans, et cetera. The thing you can't tell is speed or angle, how fast and how far.
You don't really find out about how good your culture is until things are hard.
I don't think the analyst community really fully understands how much of the cloud infrastructure is based on NetApp.
How do you feel NetApp has contributed back to the ecosystem of the Valley?
NetApp has always had a pretty active program around giving back to the community, I mean, in the sense of financial or talent. We've also got involved as a manager team, primarily through Sequoia, but in terms of being board members of their firms. And I think I've been on now altogether roughly 10 Sequoia boards over time. I can think of several other executives at NetApp that have gone on then to play board roles, meaningful board roles, in significant companies.
I was told by one of the VCs that turned us down, I think it was Andy Ratcliffe at Benchmark, he said, not only did we screw up not investing in you guys, but you guys started a whole new zone of style of company, this hardware appliance that just does one thing like that, and we pay very close attention to startups of that nature now.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming. As Marguerite said, I'm Bill Barnett, a professor at Stanford Business School. And let me add my thanks to Marguerite and everyone at the Computer History Museum for what you're doing to help us understand the miracle of innovation that is the Valley. We will begin by talking on the topic of leadership and culture. And back when I was a young professor, I got a call from Chuck Holloway, who's here. Chuck, who was a senior professor. Now, if you've ever been a junior professor and you get a call from a senior professor, there's a particular dynamic that goes on, and I was a little tense about it. And he said, well, we'd like to introduce you to somebody. He's a no messing around CEO with an interesting young company. And so the first time I ever left the business school to walk into a company was to go spend some time with you guys, and I've never been the same since. And I'll never forget it, because it was about a month after you'd gone public, and the founders were there, and Dan, of course, and a handful of other people around the table. And Dan's question was, we've got a problem. Too many people here say they do things because Dan said so. And that's not a reason. And this says a lot about the culture. They were explicit as a team in building the organization around a culture. I still remember Jeff Allen, who joined the company not too long after that and played an important COO-like role in the company, used to talk about the 7-second rule. And I use the 7-second rule to this day at the Stanford Business School to talk about culture. Because even if they don't call it that, people use it at NetApp all the time. And not long ago, back at now the new gigantic NetApp campus, I heard somebody using the 7-second rule. And it goes like this. You ask somebody to do something, you take 7 seconds to explain why. It makes all the difference. You know, I want you to come into work this weekend. In a lot of companies, that's where it ends. And, you know, then they're on the phone. Yeah, I got to work this weekend. Yes, I've been passing my resume around. No, I mean, this is the job, right? I mean, that's kind of the, no, 7-second rule. I need you to come into work this weekend because a customer is doing an install. We can't wait for them to get a beep on Monday. We need you there to make the call. It puts that reason you wanted into the dialogue. And I hear that to this day in NetApp, and that's a result of the culture. So now to hear a little more about the NetApp culture, let's watch this clip.
When the dot-com bubble blew, 70% of our business was tech or internet. 70%. 700 million out of $1 billion. We were more exposed in Sun Microsystem, more exposed in SGI, more exposed in a long line of companies that are no longer here. Now you find out if you have a culture, don't you?
You and Tom were both very conscious about what kind of culture you wanted to create. I think coming out of HP, you'd seen what you felt was a good, effective culture and struggled at NET to make it happen in a company that was big already, and you showed up and NetApp was 40 people and you had very strong ideas, and you and Mendoza really resonated. Me and James were kind of clueless. We were like engineers. Eventually you convinced us, but it didn't come from us. It came from you and Tom and other hires. I mean, you made hires on that basis.
We've donated a lot of talent. We've developed a lot of talent. I know one of my favorite metrics as a former CEO is that 8 people that worked at NetApp during my tenure went on for their next role to be a CEO. Some of them are running Sequoia companies, competing with NetApp.
I think we've created something special, and I think a lot of the folks who've left that you talked about, that CEOs, and they in the same way that I think you carried a piece of HP with you, people are carrying pieces of NetApp with them.
All right, well, gentlemen, thanks for joining me. Let me introduce the panel to everyone. I think most people know Dan Warmenhoven, longtime CEO of NetApp. So good to have you here, Dan.
It's always a pleasure, Bill.
Amit Pandey. Now, Amit is an interesting story. 1998 was the year you joined, and is one of a number of former NetApp employees who went on to be a CEO of a company. In fact, you're a serial CEO, I think most recently of ZenPrize. But so in the spirit of a 360-degree view of this company, someone who was inspired to go out and
inspired to leave.
And yeah, that's right. That's right. Speaking of which, that worked pretty well for you, founder of NetApp. So it's Dave Hitz. I think most people here know, founder and
Thank you.
long time inspiration to generations of NetApp employees, and so you're not ever in absentia. And Rob Salmon, you were the first sales rep, and of course now company president, and there all the way. What was your employee number?
21.
Employee number 21. So we'll have a few minutes, and I'll ask you guys some questions about NetApp culture, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Early on, I've got to go to the founder for the first question on culture. Early on, when you and Dave and Mike were
I am Dave.
Just and James and Mike were. Well, they'll fix that in the cutting room.
Since you're mentioning Mike,
Mike's there.
You should. Why don't you stand up, Mike? Mike is
Malcolm.
the other founder of NetApp.
The other Mike Malcolm.
He was in the picture holding the box.
Yes,
with
right.
me, and just to be clear, he's the one who called James and I and said, I have an idea. It wasn't the other way around. So just context for this whole thing.
That's important. That's very important. Thank you. So talk a little about the beginnings and the culture of NetApp.
You know, the way I've often described the culture of NetApp, Mike had been a professor, and it felt like a professor with his grad students. I mean, I think he once told me that the technical work I did at NetApp would have qualified me for a PhD if I weren't getting paid for it. And you know, it was just a handful of us. But one of the big constraints on NetApp was we could never convince venture capitalists to fund us. And we never did get any venture funding until after we shipped product. We got a whole series of angels. And the end result of that was we had to squeeze like crazy. I mean, there were so many features that we dropped out of the product. And the interesting thing to me, and this has been a big lesson, we had a long list of features that we thought were important that we wanted to put in. We dropped all of them out and shipped. And the stuff the customers complained loudest about mostly wasn't the stuff on our list that we had dropped. Some of those features didn't make it in for 10 years or more. I mean, at this point, I think finally we have almost all of them, although not all of them. And it just says something about getting it out the door.
That's interesting. Yeah,
There's
go
an
ahead.
attitude of frugality, though, that kind of got, because there wasn't enough money in the company, the whole notion of spending, hiring, et cetera, people were very cautious about getting too far in advance. You should tell them the story about your very first test system.
I will. First, I'll tell the story, though, of Dan Warmenhoven. That's a Dutch name. And Dan explained that copper wire was invented by two Dutch guys fighting over a penny.
Yeah. You told me that one, too. Every time I went for budget.
I fit right in.
We were trying to convince investors that we could make something really fast. And we had a message passing operating system, and Mike swore that it would be fast enough, and the investors were like, nah, those things are too slow, and Mike's like, no, I've done this before. And I was trying to test it on my PC at home, which was a 486, and that wasn't good enough, and I wanted to do some benchmarking, and so I made a boot floppy that was my own operating system, and I snuck into Fry's, and I would put that floppy disk into the computers at Fry's, and they would run my own operating system, put up the number, which was the performance result, and then hang because it was not a real operating system. And so I'm walking to the fastest computer I can, and eventually some Fry's guy's like, "What, may I help you?" And so I'm trying to get him off my tail, so I was like, you know, this computer seems to be hung. What do you think that number is? And I got about 4 more. So that was our very first benchmarking. Another thing, this is a story about James Lau. He was the one responsible for assembling the hardware. And we basically went to Fry's and got a black tower from Fry's, and it was like an off-the-shelf PC motherboard, which it turns out was not a good idea. They just didn't have the reliability we needed for a file server. But anyway, that story came later. But James was not a manufacturing guy, but he did know that manufacturing people do heat tests of their systems. And so he built with PVC pipe and garden black plastic a heat tent and put the computer in it and got one of those little propane torches with the thing going up there and put that inside the tent, and then we went out to lunch. No, fortunately the building didn't burn down, but we came back and the torch was tipped over and the carpet was melted, but the system was still running. That's the point.
I think this answers a question right there. Can a founder be an inspiration for a culture? And I think it says it. Speaking of which, Amit, if we could just talk about the effects of the culture on you. Obviously, you did leave NetApp, and then in running your own companies, was there an imprint there of the culture?
Dan scarred me for life.
Shaped you.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think probably it sounds trite, but the biggest lessons that I learned from Dan, Jeff Allen, Dave, and others is I believe in the companies that I've led, the 2 companies I've led. I've tried to create an open culture that's values the people and is and I mean this in the most positive way, a very consensus-oriented style. I remember once going to Dan as I'm a 30-year-old who knows exactly what needs to be done. I said, Dan, why are we wasting time with all these people who don't have any idea what we're doing in this market? I was running a business unit that was was a startup within NetApp, focusing on internet content. And so Dan said, he was very patient with me. He said, yeah, you're right. We the two of us know where we need to go, but we really should convince everybody else because, as difficult as that may sound, it will pay dividends later when we start to execute. And so, that's a lesson that I've taken with me. And that's something that NetApp was actually, I think NetApp's biggest strength was, we wouldn't follow a lot of the fads. I don't know if you remember the companies such as Ink2Me that disappeared after creating a short bursts of shareholder value, if you could call it that. But Dan and I would have conversations and say, should we do this? And and we would come to the conclusion that no, this is flavor of the month. Let's wait. Let's do the right thing. And even in the areas where we competed with those guys, we outlasted them. And I think it's because of the culture, the way the company was set up around its open decision-making style.
That's interesting. Do you want to comment on this, Dan?
I think Amit did a good job on it. You got to remember when he joined NetApp, he essentially had no commercial business experience. He was a McKinsey consultant, so he always had the right answer, but he
Not
never
that
had
there's
to
anything
implement
wrong with that. Some of my best friends are.
I know. And in fact, we had most of those 8 actually people that went on to be CEOs in the next step were McKinsey refugees, where they get to the point in their career where they decide they don't want to be a consultant, they want to actually be an operator.
Yeah.
And he became the prototype for half a dozen more people like him who moved into the company, took on significant operating roles, kind of learned how to run a business, learned about being part of a corporation, and then went on to be very successful on their own, some of whom are now competing with us.
Yeah, that's what happens. And, Rob, Dave talked about the decision to go to market as quickly as possible, not develop features in order to do so. And from a sales perspective, that must have felt, well, let me just open it up to you. How did that decision feel to you from the sales view?
Honestly, Bill, with the product, when I joined NetApp in January of '94, I went over because a friend of mine was there and said, well, I'm going to look to hire for a sales rep. We got a sales leader in the East, one in the West. Look for a first salesperson. I wasn't that interested. I was doing well at Sun. And by the 3rd interview, I thought, if they can do what they say they can do, I can sell a lot of this stuff. Our challenge wasn't more features. All we had to do was get you to try it. And it took a total of 15 minutes to install it, and you would be serving data, and you would buy it. It was that much faster in software development, chip design, hitting your return key. So to Dave's point, it really wasn't about more features. We were so much better than anybody else in terms of performance and getting jobs done that we didn't need more features. We needed more presence and getting people to just try it.
What kind of companies did you go after?
Synopsys, Cirrus Logic, Tandem Computers was early, HAL Computers, Netcom. You remember the old Netcom?
Sure.
We were early into Motorola.
Chip design, programmers. Those were the customers. Chip design and programmers.
Well, I would throw 2 more in there. It was the internet service providers, which was just emerging at the time. Netcom here in San Jose was a big customer. They had 2 applications that they really didn't have a good solution for, and NetApp fit right in. Email. Remember, email was just kind of exploding. And the other was Usenet News. I don't know if anybody remembers Usenet News.
Well, we're in a
news
museum,
feeds
so
coming in and spools going out, and we had enough IOs to be able to keep up. But we solved those 2 problems, and so the tech community and the internet community became our primary customer.
I mean, the internet, you folks that came later, I was talking about the early days.
Yeah, and in fact, I think, so we're about to open it up to audience questions, but I want to point something out to those who don't know it. In the very earliest days, Mike and Dave and James had conceived of a strategy that would go after tiny companies because of the simplicity of the toaster. no discussion of speed. And so what's so interesting about this is that the culture of your organization allowed you to learn, even from the customers. To this day, Mark Leslie and Chuck Holloway's Sales Learning Curve article, which is a great article, I use that and tell the story that you just told about how you learned about the market along the way. And it takes a great culture to learn that way. Let's open it up to questions from the audience now. If you'd like to ask a question, we'd like to sort of stay on the culture theme. We'll have some other themes. Go ahead and raise your hand, and we have some folks with mics who will bring you a microphone so that you can ask a question.
You have to choose one.
Oh, they've got it here.
Thank you. Angela Hay, TechVisor. I wondered if there was anything special about the way you coded and your coding culture, because although it's a hardware company, it was really a software. There was a lot of it.
I'll just tell you one story. A guy showed up, a junior programmer, and he looked at my code and he said, "You are a horrible coder. You don't know the first thing about coding because you didn't follow rule number 1. Your code is entirely filled with comments." Other than that, I think it was fairly traditional.
And I have to say, that is the shortest answer I have ever heard Dave Hitz give to any question. So we have another over here.
Hi, this is Sanjay Mittal. I think I'm interested in how you guys coped with the dot-com crash of 2000. I mean, obviously the company had 8 years, gone public, was doing well, market crashed. What changes you had to make in a hurry to survive there? Obviously, you guys survived and have continued to thrive.
So let me take that one. We didn't do anything in a hurry. The market really was in steep decline starting in basically January, and we didn't execute a layoff until August.
Of 2001, I think. We were a little late, right?
Yeah,
to get hit
but
whack.
We tried to figure out without actually, I didn't want to have a successive series of cuts. I mean, I just thought that would not be a good idea. And so basically I wanted to see kind of where the bottom was. We were in free fall for a couple quarters though. Our 4th fiscal quarter ended in April. And you remember that quarter? Mm-hmm. I mean, that was a quarter that you never missed because all the sales guys have every incentive in the world just to go close deals. We missed that quarter big time. We made the January quarter, missed the April quarter, and we knew, it was really deep. And I remember in, I think it was early June, we were deciding how big a cut to have. And I remember Chris Carlton was the VP of HR at the time. I said, we got to cut at least 10%, maybe 12. And she said, no, I've read this story about, for every 2 people you cut, 1 more self-selects out. And I mean, they decide that, the run is over or whatever and move on with their friends. So if you really want to cut 12%, you only have to cut 8%. So we cut 8%. Nobody left. The thing she left out of the analysis was there's no place for them to go because everything in the tech sector was really on the floor. But and we did what we could to kind of keep the cash flows going, and that quarter in August, as I recall, at the layoff, if you excluded the separation expenses, we basically broke even, which is kind of where we tried to size it to. We thought that was the right balance point between preserving our future and not creating any issues with the shareholder community, and that worked. But in the meantime, and you'll get to this, I'm sure, later, we had tried to reposition the company away from tech and internet. You heard Mendoza say at that time 70% of our revenues were from tech and internet. And within a year or 2, that was quickly replaced by 5 or 6 other major verticals.
We're also very fortunate that, 2 things are true when you work with Dan. One, you always work for Dan once you've worked for Dan. And the other thing is, although he's happy here, Dan in business review is never happy. It's just a matter of what he's not going to be happy about. Our former CFO, Steve Gomo's over there laughing. It's true. So Dan was always pushing us. When we were doing so well in the dot-com bubble, it was true. We were winning big, huge here in Silicon Valley in the West. But in Germany, they didn't see the same explosion of the dot-com that we saw. Mm-hmm. So they'd come over, and they'd say, well, what do? I'd say, call on the dot-coms. We have automotive. We have major manufacturing. We have banks. So our support of database came out of the work from our German team. Our support of building a clustered failover system came out of that team. So some of the enterprise work, the foundation was laid arguably outside of Sunnyvale and what we were doing during the dot-com era, with the areas that were not being able to benefit from that. They had to sell to traditional enterprises. That really helped us out an awful lot.
I think Dan's being modest. He had started, at least our business unit, we came out with our first enterprise product in 2001. Right. And it's partly because we could sense the craziness, and he was pushing us, as Rob says, to get enterprise customers, to get into the financial services and all that. And that's why NetApp survived, and companies like Ink2Me disappeared.
I want to tell a culture story about Dan. I remember the meeting when we announced the layoff, and a lot of companies were saying, this is it. We're never going to do another layoff right now. And how could you know that? And someone in the company all hands asked Dan, are we going to do another layoff? And Dan told the story he just told. He said, if you go negative in profit, that's when you start dying as a company. We're going to take it to zero. We tried to size it to get that right. But I can't promise you we're not. I hope we're not. And I asked him about that afterwards, because everyone else was taking a different path. And he just said, you have to trust your employees and treat them like grown-ups.
Well, the other thing I told him was go sell something in a hurry.
There was still no messing around on that. All right, well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for addressing the culture issue. We're going to make a transition now, so I'll thank you, Amit, for your contribution here. Thank you very much. Let's hear it for Amit. So the next of the three topics is innovation. Obviously, this is a temple of innovation here in a place that's marked by it, and we're all thinking technology. I'm going to point out, however, that NetApp is as important for business model innovation as it is for technology innovation. I'm going to allude to the point that Dan just made. It wasn't just a reaction to the bursting of the dot-com bubble. In fact, I have somewhere, although I think we probably couldn't get PowerPoint to read them anymore, slides that you made in, would it have been 98?
I think it was probably 98.
98, for an offsite that we did during the heady days when Dan Warmenhoven told his leadership team that they were going to move beyond tech. So while everybody else was making hay while the sun shines,
the dot and .com.
Yeah, we had Warmenhoven telling his team it was time to have a different approach to the business, to go enterprise before people were using the term enterprise. That caught on a little bit later, and that's leadership. Yeah, that's innovation, where you're doing something that is not conforming to the trend. And it turns out the reaction to the downturn would have been a lot different, and your ability to have the kind of response you had, Rob, would have been a lot different if it hadn't have been for that. So we'll talk a lot more about innovation in a second, but to get us going on that, we're going to take a look at this clip.
Within 30 days of me being in the company, I kind of concluded that the product we had was very saleable, but we weren't very good at it. The company had already been through a lot of internal discussions about is it direct or indirect or whatever. We decided it's going to be primarily a direct sell. And I think we went from 4 salespeople to 12 in 6 months. That year, we finished at 15 million. The following year, the year we went public, we were 45 or 46. So I mean, we tripled in 1 year. It was all a result. The product was fundamentally the same thing we had the day I walked in the door. But it was all a result of finding a sales strategy that worked, finding a customer profile we could kind of really focus on.
I had a titanic argument with Dave once, semi-publicly. The wimpy director telling the head of engineering that we were going down too narrow a road.
And I think the argument was, do you go after this larger market and pour most of your future investment there, or do you stay in the file server business and continue to grow your share there? And James was on the note, you got to go to the SAN. I remember Dave saying, look, we don't have the capability, the financial resources, et cetera, to do that well. We should stay in the file server business. So here's the two founders, both of whom are, it's too bad James isn't here, both of whom have quite a compelling argument, right? And as a CEO, I couldn't sort it out. And so I said, all right, look, why don't you guys just hold this debate in front of the board, and we'll get them to kind of opine and share their wisdom. And sure enough, that's what happened.
And Don said something like, in this economy, if a customer would like to give you money, I recommend you take it. And I just thought that was such crystal clear business wisdom.
All right, and to talk more on innovation, joining the panel is Deborah Martucci from Synopsys. Deborah was the first customer.
One of the very first.
One of the very first customers of NetApp.
First big customer, $400,000.
There
so
huge.
With
Thank you. Yeah. That was
he
a great
was my
deal.
sales guy.
Okay.
That's right.
All right, so thanks for joining us here.
Nice to be here.
We talk a lot about innovation in the business school, and one of the difficulties is that after the fact, there's so much retrospective rationalization of the stuff that works. But to be frank, at the time you're being an innovator, it can be very lonely. And I want to come back to you, Dave, on this to start it off. Do you want to comment on that?
One of the things that we had really focused on, it wasn't the main requirement for the markets we were going after, but we were focused a lot on speed. How to make this thing faster. And one of the real challenges we had was people at that time were looking for how many operations per second can file servers do. 5,000, 10,000, giant numbers. And it turned out that if you just want to get your little job done, what mattered a lot more was how quick you turned each one around. And so our competitor could do, I forget how many thousands, Auspex was maybe 10,000. Yeah. The max we could do was 400, but we did those 400 so fast. But it was such a struggle convincing people that the #1 benchmark that told that our system was not nearly as good as the others, that benchmark wasn't measuring mostly the right thing. I mean, it reported the speed of each operation as well, but that wasn't the number everybody looked at. And so that is really the point of why Rob said we had to demo it, because it wasn't until people actually tried it and they were like, oh my God, look how fast it was. How could it be that fast with a smaller number? The analogy I use is a station wagon will carry a lot of people. A Porsche will get you there faster.
There was a particular customer at Western Digital. I remember this one well. I forget the gentleman's name. They had a chip that if you took the biggest Sun servers and Auspex servers and did this application called Cadence Dracula, which was design, placement, and wiring, it ran 18 hours. 18 hours, you get one pass a day. Your engineering team looks at the results. They try to figure out what to change, turn it in again at the end of the day, come back next morning and see the results. When he unplugged the Auspex server and put in the NetApp server, the 18 hours went to 2 hours. So you could do how many passes per day, right? I mean, so it's not just time to job completion, it's time to market. It's engineering productivity, it's a whole series of other economic issues that kind of fall out from there. And the same thing happened for software builds and other kinds of things that changed the dynamics around how you thought about, how many turnarounds do I get per day?
Yeah, Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation hadn't hit the press, or had just hit the press then, but I think this is an example.
It's funny, Clayton, who I really love, told me that he just completed his book, and he was fascinated about us. He heard about us when we were on the IPO roadshow. And he started following us at that point and bought stock at the opening. And wanted to test his theory in real life practice.
That's interesting.
He did okay with it.
Yeah, I should think so.
Yeah.
It's
he made more money off the NetApp stock than he did from the Innovator's Dilemma.
So I think he's on the EMC board, but he's investing in it. That's interesting. Deborah, from the customer's perspective, what's your reaction to this discussion of their product?
Well, again, we bought our first product in January of '94, I believe, and I just bought my last one this past Christmas.
My goodness.
Customer,
only because you retired in January.
I retired in January.
Okay, all right.
Just to make that clear. And I would say to you, my company being in EDA, electronic design automation, we had to deal with Moore's law, and storage reflected that to the T. We were doubling our storage year over year, and I obviously couldn't double my IT staff, and I could, we had so many challenges back then, as we all know. The scalability needs of chip design were just out of control. And so we sometimes thought it was like the whack-a-mole game. Like, we're trying to do high-performance computing. Was storage a bottleneck for a while? We'd get corrections and solutions. Then the compute server was the problem. Then the network, and on came the game. But in our culture of Synopsys, which I've always felt and has been in alignment with NetApp for all these years, I've spoken at sales conferences. I've been a very strong advocate of the NetApp culture and product line. And again, because I think it followed a lot of what I was living at Synopsys for 23 and a half years. And, partnership was the name of the game.
I think our proudest moment at Synopsys was when, as I recall, you moved to data center.
Yes.
And so one of the things we had to do as we went into the enterprise was build a professional services organization. But Deborah didn't need that. I mean, she had a very technically proficient staff. She didn't need us to help. I mean, she asked our advice, but basically she had a staff that could self-perform until they came to a big data center move. And then I remember she spoke to me and said, we're going to need your help.
Yeah.
And as I recall, we called in every professional services person from California and probably Arizona as well, and executed that move between a Friday night and a Sunday afternoon, as I recall.
Right.
And they were up and running on Sunday morning or Sunday night, and it was all done.
We had the dinner Friday night to kick them all off, and there were probably more NetApp guys in the room than my guys. And it was, back then, those were the challenges that we really all stood up for, and really it invigorated us all to say, we're going to nail this, we're going to do it. And I had, 8,000 engineers coming in Monday morning expecting to be able to do their job.
Wow.
And they did it with the help of NetApp.
Synopsys was a great partnership for us. When we did the deal in 1994, it was the biggest deal in the history of the company. And at that time, I think we were the biggest system we sold was 14 1-gigabyte drives, and they bought a lot of them because the systems went for $15,000, $20,000. So we didn't have a big support staff. We didn't have professional services. We had engineers go over to Synopsys. We were in Mountain View, right next door on Bernardo,
about a half mile away.
Yeah.
So over the weekend, we had development engineers go over and help install these. They came back the next week and said, these would be a lot easier to install if we had thumb screws versus having to use Phillips screwdrivers. So it was amazing because enormous learnings, but then Synopsys also hosted Baylisa. And Dave, you remember, we used to go to Synopsys for Baylisa, large installation system administrator group meetings. And so they'd have all of these prospects come in. They'd have to walk by the data center. It was all NetApp, and we'd have somebody like Dave in speaking. It's good to be a sales rep. It worked out well.
So Deborah did something interesting to you. You asked her about innovation, and she said, yeah, products were good, but I like their culture.
Yeah, I noticed
that. And it's actually interesting because, when you're in Silicon Valley for a long time, sometimes your products are ahead, and sometimes you have an issue, and we've had a lot of customers say to us things like, of course your products need to work, and of course they need to be price competitive, but if there's a tie, we would rather work with you. We like working with you. And there is an enormous benefit you get from having that bit of forgiveness, bit of benefit of the doubt. And I think that came out in her answer on innovation. I like to think we did a lot of innovation too, but I think you get cut some slack if they also like you.
It's also a virtuous cycle. We used to have Deborah and some of her counterparts participate in a very exclusive forum with just a hand-picked set of executives. And I remember, actually, it started with Ken Venner, and I remember you chimed in and said, absolutely. You remember Ken? Yeah. So he was the CIO of Qualcomm. Broadcom. And it was, I think, 1996 or 97, and we were talking about what could we do to help you. And he says, well, I'm trying to replace, so I should back up. Our systems are aimed at Unix environments, Unix desktops, Unix servers. And Ken said, the Windows environment has gotten to be good enough where I'd like to replace all my Unix desktops with Windows desktops, but I can't figure out how to share the data. It's very complicated. And I remember Deborah going, yeah, that's a mess. And so we went off and we did the industry's first Windows Unix file server multi-protocol to go solve a customer problem but it fueled the next stage of our growth. And it took us into the Windows-only environment and led to the next, $3 billion of market to be addressed. It was great. So they told us exactly where to go. They charted our roadmap.
That's interesting because it's an innovation that from the very top you can see you getting behind as leaders. Rob, do you mind if I ask you to comment on the story of Andreas Koenig and the way he brought that cluster technology into, it's kind of a cold call here. I didn't warn people so if you don't remember, I'll tell you. But do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so Andreas Koenig ran Germany for us back in the 90s. He was our first employee in Europe, left a few years ago. He's running a software company now in Germany. But Andreas, as I said earlier, he didn't benefit from the dot-com era. He was calling on banks and he was calling on the automotive industry. He was competing against big enterprise players where things like failover mattered. So Andreas came to us and said, you got to do two things for me. Cluster failover, the system, if it goes down, there has to be another one that comes up, and you have to support database. And that was at a time where us guys in Silicon Valley and in the West were saying, we're fine, no more features, we're good.
Right,
Things that Deborah may need for software development, but the enterprise, I'm not going up to San Francisco. I've got engineering tech down here. I'm going to stay right here. Andreas said, I can't win in my market unless you do that. The same was true with, in Australia, Simon Green, who you talked about. In fact, we got Jeff Smith back here with us from Australia. One of our early customers was Paul from Telstra. They were saying the same thing, that the requirements of what you're doing for Silicon Valley, we have different enterprise requirements. Things like cluster failover, supporting database, Oracle database. And Andreas and Simon really helped lead us there.
Yeah, and I think what's so striking about that story, and Dan, maybe you'd want to comment on this from the position where you saw it, is that what Andreas worked on, what he did, and what Simon was working on, strictly speaking, was against a set of decisions that had already been made with respect to the technology, but he did it anyway.
It wasn't against it. It was a little early. And we knew we were going to get there. It was only a function of time. And Andreas was very clever. If you recall the first customer he sold to, so his territory was primarily Germany. I mean, that's where the big market was.
Sure.
But he was an Austrian. And he went back and sold the first system to, and I forget the name of the newspaper, but it was basically the newspaper he read every day as a kid. And that's where he sold the first database cluster failover system. The idea being if it fell apart, the guy he sold it to was a friend of his. He probably could keep it quiet, not make the press, and it wouldn't pollute any of the customers back on the other side of the border with Germany.
Interesting.
So even though he was a very aggressive risk taker, at the same time he kind of contained his own.
Was there a
risk
price list for that product?
Oh, that was another discussion with Andreas. Yeah, there was. In fact, we had a policy at the time that our maximum discounts would be around 20%. And of course, at the time, the euro wasn't around, right? It was the German mark, and so Andreas basically decided I can't do 20% discounts. My customers are used to more like 40 or 50, so he took our price list and doubled it. The ratio of the mark to dollar was about 2 to 1, and he just took the dollar numbers and put marks next to it. And then he could give a 50% discount, have nice margins, and he told me this one day, and I went, "You idiot! This is never going to last," And he says, "Trust me, we'll get through the year."
I think the case study you did on NetApp, that globalization, cliff notes I like to tell people when I think about what we did in Australia and Germany is, the further away you are from corporate, the more you ignore them to be successful. Right. And those two, they did it well.
Right. Yeah. And that's getting back to your point and reflecting on your point then as well, Deborah, right? I mean, we talk about it as technology innovation, but we know the track record in industrial evolution is that you can come up with technology all you want, but until you can actually deliver it and price it and make it work for a customer, it's not really an innovation.
In your market.
Yeah,
where you are.
That's right. And so one of the great things about this company is that it is an example of how you bring the innovation all the way to market. And despite the fact that it was sometimes out of bounds to get there.
We learned so much.
Nobody got shot for that, though. It was out of bounds. It was, as long as it worked here.
Well, that's what's key.
Money.
That's what's key. There are companies, believe me, Dan, where people get shot for
I know.
doing that.
Andreas went on to run all of Europe for many years. And Simon Green in Australia, I'm sure Jeff Smith, who's here from Telstra at the time, Simon was the same way. I mean, he kind of created his own ground rules, decided how he was going to attack his own markets, decided what he had to do. You know, it's another thing, it's interesting. Companies don't buy from companies. People buy from people. And if they trust you and trust that you're going to have their best interest at heart, they'll take a risk on you and your technology and your company. And that's exactly what we did around the globe.
Well put.
So while these people did rather creative and unusual things, what they really did was build trust with the clientele that they were actually trying to service.
Sure.
And that was all fine. So, and they were wildly successful with it.
Yeah, Dave, you were going to comment on this.
Oh, I was just going to comment on how much we learned from our customers. One of my favorite examples of that, at the time there were the expensive fast drives and there were cheap, shitty, slow drives. And we made a product out of the cheap, shitty, slow drives. And one of the rules that we had, by this time we were selling database, we were like, this is not a product for databases. Do not sell this into a database customer because you're going to end up screwed. And I remember that one of the sales guys came to me, I want to take you to a customer, I want to talk about selling this product to a database application, but don't bite my head off, I think it might work. And I'm like, who is it? And he said, Oracle. And it turned out that Oracle wanted to use this product for their test environment because they couldn't afford enough of the expensive storage. And they're like, you know, it's just for testing. And it ended up that Oracle internally became using our systems that we were telling people don't use it for database to use it for the test and development environment for database, gave us some really interesting ideas of how to make it better for that. And through that partnership ended up turning it into good for production. So I mean, it's just the openness to sort of going places that wasn't where you meant. That's a great source of innovation.
It really is. Now I'd like to open it up now to questions from the audience. So if we can be on the topic of innovation as much as possible, but who'd like to ask a question?
I'll tell
we have
a
one
quick
back
story
over here.
Okay.
So you always have your first flagship customers in areas like tech.
Well, I should ask you, maybe introduce yourself to the group. Please.
Dave Anderson, Computer History Museum, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But the things that really make it go are when you have those few really big flagship customers that decide this is... Well, but Synopsys is kind of tech. How about people outside of tech that really were legendary hits?
Yeah. So I'll give you a few. So one in the internet space, Yahoo, which today still is a multiple petabyte customer. How many petabytes they got? 20?
Oh, a lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
And we're influential in our evolution. I'd be happy to tell you that story too. But the one that I probably, you're thinking of in terms of classic enterprise, I think probably the biggest one was Morgan Stanley when Guy Cirillo was there.
Yeah.
We had gone through the dot-com bust, and I told people, I wore the leather off the soles of my shoes, pounding up and down Wall Street trying to sell something, as did Mendoza for years, and never could crack the financial services community. And one day I was in my office. Why I was in my office, I don't know, because I'm never in my office. And the phone rang, and I answered it. I don't know why that happened either, because I never answered my phone. And I picked it up and said, hi, this is Dan. And it's Guy Cirillo, who at the time was the CIO of Morgan Stanley. And he'd been a customer of mine at my former company, NET, and we had a personal relationship to a degree. And he says, Dan, he says, can your stuff really do what you say? Of course, he's a New Yorker, right? I mean, I don't think he said stuff. I think he said shit. and I said, Guy, to the best of my knowledge, we've never oversold it. I mean, it's always lived up to whatever claims we've made. And I said, yes, whatever you've been told, whatever claims we've made, I'm sure can be fulfilled. He says, that's good. He says, in that case, I got to buy a ton of it. Send your rep in. And sure enough, within a week or so, we had a proof of concept, and within a month we had a PO, and Guy Cirillo became to the financial services community what Deborah had been to the tech sector. He became our primary sponsor and told the rest of his friends why it was a good solution. and it saved him a lot of money, and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Okay. So I think that's probably where you're going, right?
The dynamic there, you didn't sort of describe why the tech crash was so good for us. During the dot-com boom, the bankers, we thought our product was faster, which was good, and cheaper, which was good, and their response was, that is not my problem. We have plenty of money. Have you checked that out lately in the late 90s, banks? But the CIO, my number one problem is I got to scale this thing fast enough to keep up with our growth. My number two problem is I got to make sure it doesn't crash. And the last thing I need is some startup helping me with that. After the tech crash, suddenly cheaper, faster was exactly what they needed. And so they were suddenly willing to make changes they hadn't considered before. That was why Guy called. And all over, people who had just strong-armed us, it was like, well, okay, we'll try. It hurts. We'll try something new.
Sure.
We also had, if you think about, again, back to software development, all these big enterprises do it some way, somehow. So in the energy space, we got close with Landmark Graphics. And they realized that we could help them an awful lot, be more successful what they're doing. So folks like Exxon down in Houston, we still today have a very big business in oil and gas and energy. And it was the early days of really getting to know the software application space well. Then here in the United States, if you want to be big, you have to crack the US federal government. And we put a team on that. Dan was very involved in the late 90s. We created a US federal subsidiary and actually pulled it out of the Americas altogether last part of last decade. And that really took off for us. So really a concerted effort. And that's a very different sales model. You're talking about capture managers that'll work 2 to 3 years before
one deal
payback on one deal. But those deals are enormous, and we've done well there.
Well, with that, we're going to bring the innovation session to an end. And I'd like to thank you, Rob. If we could all thank Rob. He's actually. If you think about it, it's a luxury that we could have him because he's actually still in the hot seat. So here we're all thinking back. So now we're going to turn our attention to business ecosystem, which is one of those Silicon Valley terms. And I notice if I use those terms in class, everyone's eyes glaze over. So maybe to make it concrete, I'll tell a little bit of a story. Not long after I had developed an early case study of you guys, I'm walking down the hall in the Stanford Business School, and I am passing John Morgridge, who, with Chuck Holloway, was teaching our entrepreneurship course. Now, if you're a junior professor and you're walking by John Morgridge, you just sort of walk past him. And he looks up, makes eye contact with me, and he says, "So I understand you're the one with this case study of network appliance," or some. I can't do a very good likeness of John, but and so now I'm stunned. Yeah, I'm stunned. He's talking to me, and he says, "I want to teach that case," and he has taught you, and he and Chuck have taught that case in their class ever since. I think it's the then grew it into the growth case and so forth. And it's a great example that John, who obviously in his time with Cisco could just use his own example as a focused strategy with a scalable model that grows by being excellent at what it does, just everything about what you would describe NetApp as, you have to describe Cisco under John Morgridge's leadership that way, and yet he was using you as that example because he saw you as the epitome of that. And we think of the business ecosystem, you think of the people moving around, but there are a set of ideas flowing around here too. And you've been central to that currency of ideas, and as that story, I think, relates. And now we're going to have a little bit of a story on a film clip.
Could NetApp have been the company designed and launched anywhere else other than Silicon Valley?
I think the odds would be long, personally. Part of our success actually came from proximity to Sun. We hired a number of the engineers directly from Sun who invented NFS. So part was availability of skill.
I mean, lawyers are trained, accountants are trained, manufacturing people are available. I mean, all kinds of skill factors are available that are not available in anywhere the quality or quantity elsewhere in the country.
I think until you're actually immersed in it and understand the ecosystem, the venture capital system, all the rest of the firms, it's really hard to appreciate from the outside.
Now, to me, the biggest part of the infrastructure that never gets talked about is Silicon Valley is a creation of immigrants and emigrants. So it isn't something that has been recently created or shows difficulty in sustainability. As long as those immigrants are coming and emigrants are coming, we'll have the key component, the key ingredient, smart people.
Well, I think it's been self-perpetuating. I do worry about can another one emerge, and certainly if it's going to emerge somewhere in the world, it's probably going to be in the area around Shanghai, because they got a lot of the same phenomena going on that started the valley. And I think the question is, does the valley sustain itself, right? Or do you lose leadership in terms of entrepreneurship and creativity to something like Shanghai? I think that's yet to be played out.
All right, and now to help us on the panel to talk about the business ecosystem view of things, we have Bob Wall, who in '93 joined NetApp as an outside director and has been an outside director ever since then. So I think except for Dave and Mike, among those who are here, you go back the furthest.
I think there were, what, 6, maybe 7 employees when I went on the board.
Yeah.
Pretty close to that. So
thanks for taking the time, Bob, and joining us. So the business ecosystem is a very broad term. It brings to mind a lot of different ideas, but people are obviously central to that. Maybe we'll start at the level of people and move to the level of companies, if that would maybe put a little structure on it so we don't leave anything out. And I'll just give the open-ended question and see who would like to field it. How has it helped to be part of the Valley and the Valley ecosystem when it comes to people?
It's extremely fertile ground. But you know, today, if you start a company and you want to build a product or a service or whatever, the only people you hire are the engineers, the creators. Everything else you buy. You buy HR, you buy IT, you buy legal service, you buy manufacturing services or prototype, you buy everything. And so the amount of cash that's required in order to launch is much less than it was even when NetApp was built. And so all the services you would ever need are available to you within about, well, I'll say an hour commute, but it's really about 8 miles.
In the good times.
In the good times, yeah. But even the customers, and I do mean that. The customer community here is also less conservative, more open to try new things, and is also fertile ground for betas. That's how Deborah became a customer. You know, that's why she was a customer 7 years before Guy Chiarello. They're risk adverse. They want a very safe, proven product. She's anxious for more performance, and whatever it takes, she'll try. If it works, great. If it doesn't, well, she'll move on. But the point is, they're very open. And I think if you look at the dynamics in the Valley, the people who invent are selling to people they know. And it's really a kind of a very closed-loop system until it's more mature.
I mean, I think it's the Valley is has a startup culture of itself on its own, and it embraces the concept of a startup. It's more accepting, risk-taking, and frankly, if you fail, it's not that huge a deal here. But people get their head around, whether it's because they're talking to their neighbor who has done a startup and had fun and created something, or it's a customer. It's the same kind of thing. It's more of an embracing area than before I came up here. I was in San Diego, and it was challenging to get people to commit to work on the weekends and have the same level of commitment and embracing the whole idea.
The whole idea of career is also different.
Yeah.
I mean, in most places of North America or the United States, your career is shaped by 2 or 3 or maybe 4 employers in your lifetime.
Right.
You expect to have that many here in 8 months.
Sure.
I got a really good 15-second lesson when I was about 25, and John Massey was the victim of my lesson in the Silicon Valley ecosystem. But I was working at MIPS at the time, and I had accepted a job offer to go to Auspex, and John was trying to convince me to stay at MIPS. And we were having some kind of company picnic, and there was a venture capitalist there, and someone on the board at MIPS. And John took me over and said, "You need to talk to this guy." And he says to the man, "But tell Dave why he should stay. I don't want him to leave MIPS." And the VC said to me, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Auspex." And he said, "Oh, yeah, that's a good company. We're invested there too. They need some people like you." and you remember that? That 15-second lesson planted in my brain, from that VC's perspective, it was like he was a vice president of one big company. Like someone moved from one department to another, and the vice president, who's the boss of both departments, going to care? It just blew my mind. It completely changed my perspective on what was happening in Silicon Valley.
Now, it's interesting because, Deborah, you stayed with your company through all those years. What is your comment on this?
Well, what I used to say at Synopsys was they just never let me get bored. And so I was fortunate to constantly have growth opportunities, challenges, bigger budgets, bigger problems to solve. And actually, to the point that was made about failing, I can remember failing fast was really our mantra. We're going to try something, and if we fail, let's fail real quickly. And so weekends, 24/7, 3 days in a row, to just run the tests that were needed so we could determine, are we going to make it or not? And if we don't, it's okay. And I can remember partnerships with NetApp and NVIDIA and Dell and 4 or 5 other companies where we all went together to do pilot prototyping over weekends because we were trying to solve problems that had never been solved before. So we were very, I thought, innovative in the sense of, we'll try it. Well, if it doesn't work, we'll call Dave, have him come help us. But I mean, it was such a fast, amazing environment to be.
Yeah. How early were you talking fail fast?
Probably by 95.
Sure.
I mean, by 95, things were just, again, outrageous and crazy. And we had so many problems when you think back in that time period. The word scalability, it seems so simple to say that word, and yet we were living it. As I was saying, doubling storage. You know, we had in our company verification jobs that could take 12 days to run on really great equipment. So if it failed halfway through, you had really pissed off people. And you had engineers that were frustrated. So back to the time to market, there were just so many challenges. And
you know, it's interesting because more recently with Lean Agile and fail fast and cheap and the different changes that have taken place, I think a lot of folks in the Valley feel like this is a new phenomenon. And in fact, the leading firms were accepting and understanding the productive role of failure even back decades ago.
Yes.
And in fact, when in my course, which you mentioned, Andy Ratcliffe, Andy and I teach a course on entrepreneurship starting this week, and on Tuesday, I'll teach fail fast and cheap and business model innovation, and I'll use the NetApp case with Mendoza in the room, because it's the classic case. And the students are shocked, and I do it on purpose because some lessons are timeless. And
because of how many times Mendoza says fuck?
That might not be the reason.
Put that one in the clip.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons. Right.
But you know, just on that same point, I can tell you that every year, Tom Mendoza, since we've spoken of his name, has always made a special effort to take myself and my staff all the way down through the management chain to the guys that work on storage to a dinner once a year.
Yep.
And we're going next Tuesday night, and it feeds back to the concept of the whole ecosystem. He respected and honored the guys and gals that were climbing around, plugging in cables and installing, hopefully with the right screws, systems. And I think it just speaks well of exactly playing back to that point.
Oh, interesting point. So, you know, I want to bump it to the organization level without getting kind of too, a lot of companies have been coming and going. And partnerships happen. Some partnerships are difficult. It's not like all of this is easy. and I want to open it up to any of you to talk about the issue of partnerships between companies.
Oh. It's always a challenging zone. Especially as a small company, the question is, why would a larger company want to spend the time or energy on you? Can you really make a difference in their outcome? And so as a smaller firm, we always looked around for who would care if we live or die. At one point, it was Microsoft. In fact, we went through what I refer to as the sine wave of good and bad with Microsoft.
Several times.
Several times, yeah. I mean, at first, if you recall, Microsoft wanted to go kill, what was the other PC software firm? NetWare? NetWare. Yeah. Novell, NetWare. Yeah. And so they partially partnered with us because we had personal connections. Steve Kleiman knew somebody, but we had all the NFS experts. We could show them how to make their CIFS architecture fast enough to kind of compete with Novell. And then they loved us. And then all of a sudden, as I recall, it was actually Jeff. The shot heard around the world from down under. He replaced something like 2,000 small Windows servers with 4 NetApp filers or something, and it just shocked the Microsoft guys. All those licenses gone, and our relationship went from really good to, and we're going to kill you, and I mean they're going to come out with a competitive product, and they're going to roll their tanks over our face, and and then we kind of made a comeback,
They fixed their licensing model.
Yeah, we fixed the licensing model. We helped develop iSCSI with them, and they could then use, a different kind of connection and areas. But it went and it was the same kind of thing. We had a great relationship for a long time with VMware, even though they were majority owned by EMC.
Yeah.
We did it with Diane Green and the rest of the team, and actually, I think we outperformed EMC with respect to having a close technology and go-to-market partnership with their own subsidiary.
Right.
Oracle was a really great partner for us for years. They were a big customer. They were a go-to-market partner until they bought Sun. That's kind of game-changing because all of a sudden they have their own storage system, and one day they're our biggest partner, the next day they're our competitor. It's just kind of the nature of the world, but it's a tough problem. We've been trying for years to get a really close partnership with Cisco. They're right down the street. We've got lots of friends, John Morgridge, John Chambers, all the rest of us. Cultures are very similar, investors are very similar, and yet we've never been able to really closely engage until the last probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 years. After they had a partnership with EMC, our #1 competitor, so we managed to turn that around and make it work for us. But it's always a challenge. And the question is, from the bigger company's perspective, why should they care about us? I mean, really, what difference does our survival make to their business outcome?
Right.
And that's a hard question to kind of get to turn around. So we've had great successes with IBM, with a number of others, but it's always that question: why do they need us?
At Cisco, it really started with the field sales force.
Yep.
Connecting with our field sales force. It wasn't Cisco embracing NetApp.
Same was true with Oracle.
Correct.
Oracle was a customer in their what they call the release center, or whatever, the production center. They were test and release, but from that, the sales teams really started to get together and figure out how to make it work. And but it didn't necessarily start out. Let me put it this way: Larry Ellison has never said, "Gee, you're a great customer, great." We kind of worked it from the back door in, And
yeah, that wouldn't be a Larry.
No, that wouldn't be Larry. Larry doesn't need us. He'll let you know that.
That's right.
But his sales team seemed to.
All right, so we're going to open it up now to some questions from. So please. Yeah. So.
So I'm John Massey, and the question is going to go towards what were really hard challenges. But I want to preface it, since Dave gave me a hard time, I want to tell you how Dave got to Silicon Valley. I was at MIPS, and MIPS was a pretty intense place, and I had only hired very senior people. Right? I was finally getting big enough I'd start to consider younger folks. And right about then, I got an email from, not Dave, but another guy at Princeton saying, I know you don't hire young guys, but I'm good, so you should talk to me. Okay? Well, I called somebody who had worked for me at Bell Labs and said, do you know this guy? Is he any good? A guy named Dan Levin, who's done pretty well.
Oh, he's done okay.
Yeah, okay, right. And she said, yeah, he's pretty good, but there's this other guy, Dave Hitz, you ought to talk to. So I sent him an email, and he sent me a resume, and we looked at the resume, and we said, this guy is crazy, right? Because he talked about going to Deep Springs, I think it was, yeah, right, college, which is sort of like a ranch, and he said he had learned about software, software, that is leather, okay, out there. What is this? Okay, right? But I trusted this woman who worked for me, and so we interviewed them, and they both came out, and they were both great. They were both too young to know what was impossible. And they did a lot of terrific stuff without realizing they were doing impossible stuff. So clearly that's part of this culture of stuff that's hard. So in your business ecosystem things, what were hard? And Dave, how did you learn to do business, not just technical hacking like you started?
I watched Dan. I learned public speaking by watching Tom Mendoza. What was hard?
Every new business we try to start, there was so much momentum going a particular direction. You heard Amit a minute ago. Just to give you a little background on what he did, we decided to take a derivative product, turn our file server into an internet caching appliance, use the same hardware, same basic operating system, put a little different front end on it, and all of a sudden it's a caching appliance. And so we got Amit to be kind of, not the general manager, but the product manager of that. Product manager for both marketing and product definition, and launch a business. Well, you can't get the sales guys' attention. They don't know what that is. I mean, if you take that business and you run it all the way through the company, you're really talking about a very different style of business, different competitors, different buyers, different whatever. And nobody, what he was talking about, how do we get people aligned? Nobody in the company really cared because they were so busy making their quota, selling basic file servers, Why would they want to go after this internet caching appliance? Well, but every time we went after a new business, that was actually the problem. Trying to take the fork, not take a fork in the road, but start another branch was always a bit of an issue. And get in the database business, you got to go get database experts, whatever it was. SAN business, the SAN business was probably the hardest because we had a lot of religious zealots around Ethernet. And SAN was a stupid and annoying
what was hard? Doubling was hard. Through most of the 90s, Dan gave some numbers, we tripled from 94 when we first started shipping to 95. During most of the 90s, we were doubling annually. Our revenue was doubling annually, which isn't hard. I mean, it's hard to do, but the employee headcount was doubling annually. And if you think about what that means culturally, half the people at your company have been there less than a year. 3/4 of the people at your company have been there for less than 2 years. And the growth rate outstrips anybody's skill. And I actually took on during that period, I called myself the vice president of doubling. And I would just go up to people and I'd say, like, you're the manager of a group of 5 people. In a year it's 10, in 2 years it's 20, in 3 years it's 40, in 4 years it's 80. Do you know how to manage a group of 80 people? You're going to have 8 managers. You're a manager. Do you know how to hire 8 managers? And if you can't do it, we'll hire someone on top of you to do it. I mean, it was just that. And that wasn't even so bad because you got knocked down one level and you could go do it again. But that's when we started the training for new employees. We called it the TOAST because of the toaster thing, training on all special things, a silly acronym. But we spent a whole day, the executive staff, Dan started this, but just if that's the challenge, half the people have been there less than a year and 3/4 of them less than 2 years, then how do you maintain any kind of a culture?
Right. So I think we have time for another question. Let's see. We have back over here.
Hi, Chris DeGiorgio. I'm retired from Accenture. Dan, you've set an example as being involved in the community and setting a business with a great place to work. So during lean times and tough times and boom times, talk about some of the experiences at the management level where that became an important thing for the company to do, not just for you personally, but for the company to be that involved and that giving back to the community.
So I give credit to Chris Carlton, who's not here tonight. Chris was really the first VP of Human Resources who advocated for us to really embrace community involvement as part of the core values of the company, and even thought of some very clever ways to promote employee involvement, company involvement, and all the rest. And it became kind of very central to the philosophy, I guess, around how we interact with our employees and how that got propagated around the globe. I'll give you some examples. We decided as an executive team that whatever little resources we had, we could donate to nonprofits, that we were not going to be the ones to make the decision. We'd let the employees kind of figure out what they wanted to do, and then the company would back them. And so I remember even before we went public, we had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich day in the cafeteria where it was executives made lunch for $10 a sandwich or something like that, and we raised thousands of dollars. And for everything that we raised, the company contributed a certain matching. We became the largest participants in the American Heart Association Heart Walk. I don't know why. Some group of employees took off and we backed them. I actually think we were kind of one of the major founders for the St. Baldrick's Shave Your Head. You saw that in the picture, but we've been doing St. Baldrick's for 10 years. Started in New York. We raised an enormous amount of money. But it's always been philosophically the employees taking the lead and the company getting behind them and trying to provide some resources and funding. And it's still that way today. But it was really Chris. In fact, she did some very creative things. We had no budget, and of course, when times are tight, you really can't afford to allocate a lot of money to it. But we had this interesting thing that she uncovered. So we have a vacation plan for employees up to the point where you become a vice president. But when you become a vice president, there is no vacation plan. It's kind of unlimited. I mean, or do your job.
Until you're fired.
Until you're fired. But there's no accrual. So at the point where some senior director got promoted to vice president, we took away all his accrued vacation and put it in the community fund. And nobody ever objected. And that's how we funded a lot of this stuff. So it wasn't necessarily taken away from shareholders. We just took it off one category in the books and put another one. But it worked out pretty well. It was very grassrootsy. And I thought it was very, very effective. And it actually is one of the things I think really drove the Great Place to Work rankings. Mm-hmm. And people felt like they could get involved in whatever nonprofit was important to them, and the company would back them. And actually, the coup de grace on that was the year we started the volunteer time off program. I think we were the first that I know of in the industry. Yep. So the idea is we'll give you 40 hours a week to get involved in whatever nonprofit you want. But we'd like to get confirmation you actually used it in some nonprofit activity.
40 hours a year, I think.
Well, I'm sorry, 40 hours a year. 1 week. Yeah, 40 hours a year. And employees loved it because it gave them guilt-free. They can now go get involved in their kids' school or whatever. And from my viewpoint, it costs the company nothing because there are about 96% professional employees who are measured by goal for the year or goal for the quarter. And they were going to get their job done regardless of whether or not they were in the office.
Dan hired Tom Georgens as Chief Operating Officer, and Tom told me a story that was interesting. He had gotten an email from an employee who was doing Christmas presents for kids who wouldn't otherwise get anything. And Tom was just really touched by this story and the passion and the energy of this woman. And he said, I love to help people like that follow their passion, because if someone's got that much passion about anything, think what they can do in their job. I want people like that. And so I think there's a very direct link from people that want to grab hold of something and make a difference and people who will grab hold of stuff at work and make a difference. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you were consciously aware of that or tapped into it accidentally, but I think there's a positive thing there.
I'm supposed to bring us to a close now. But I want to bring us to a close on this note because, if you think about technology firms in the Silicon Valley, which all of us here do, I think by definition, certainly I do, in my job at Stanford, one of the things that strikes me is that when people come here to the Valley, they want to go to the sort of headline firms, often consumer-facing, consumer product-oriented firms, the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks and the Twitters, in much the same way that when my wife and I go to Italy, we like going to the Sistine Chapel. And so they do these visits, to Google and so forth. And people are always surprised when I'm asked if I can talk about one company after all of the hundreds and hundreds of companies I've studied. I always make it NetApp. And the reason I make it NetApp, I think, is clear by all the answers you've given. Because ultimately, your answers weren't about technology. They were about the people and the character. And we all thank you for that.
Thank you, Bill. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
You're supposed to leave.
Thank you. Thanks.
Pleasure.
Deborah, it's always a pleasure, my dear.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Deborah. Great to meet you. Thanks, Marguerite.
Please join me in thanking Bill Barnett and each of the panelists again, including Amit and Rob, who are there. Did you learn something new about NetApp? Did you learn something from a 360 view of considering a company in the Valley in a new way? I hope so. You've been here with us tonight to experiment a different kind of a format in the circle. We hope that you'll take one of these comment cards that we passed out to give us feedback. We're experimenting. This is the first time we've had this kind of round conversation, this 360 view. Please tell us about your thoughts about tonight's event. We're also experimenting and trying to build a history and document history in a new way to share here at the museum and beyond. If you have ideas about building a 360 history about key organizations and key people here in the Valley and beyond, please also give your comments here on this card. We started this conversation, as I said, with oral histories earlier in the fall, and information has been coming in. Gordon Bell sent this business model presentation that the founders gave to him in 1992, and he said, here is my document that I saved with my comments. I believe they left my house that day with a $25,000 check as an angel investor. Many people here and beyond can contribute to this history of NetApp and beyond. On this card will also be an email address if you have artifacts or documents or insights or other people that should help build this kind of a history. Please add that here. This has also been a sneak peek into what our new center is doing as we're adding on to the exciting mission of the museum. As you consider what the center can do as we preserve the past and help empower the next generation, if you have ideas on the kind of activities, what are the most important things that we can be engaged in and ways to help us, please also make a comment. So these cards will be here for you as you leave. And also, here tonight we have our curators, we have trustees, we have members of the steering committee, myself. Please come up to one of us tonight. We have dessert, delicious dessert, and coffee and tea. Please enjoy the conversation with each other, but also give us your feedback. And thank you again for coming tonight to help us prototype. Thank you.